We've all heard of the Huns and we've all heard of Attila, but most people know very little else. The Huns were a nomadic people from Central Asia that over hundreds of years raided and conquered an area stretching from France to China. So it begs the question, what if the Huns never existed? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. The answers will surprise you. A big issue is that no one's entirely sure how or where the Huns started. There are 4 different groups of Huns we know of. The Xiongnu of China around a century or 2 before the birth of Christ, the Huns of Europe in the 5th century, the ones you've probably heard of, the Hephthalites or White Huns of the Middle East and India in the 4th century, and the Hunna of Indian records in the 5th century. There are serious issues with the translation of the word Hun, and no one's entirely sure if these are all the same group or different groups that have just been mislabeled. We're pretty sure that the White Huns are not related to the others, because they were probably part of a totally different language family, and the chroniclers of the time made sure to say that they were quite different from the other kinds of Huns. The Hunna of Indian records are more complicated, being probably a mix of White Huns and normal Huns, and the Xiongnu of Chinese records spark a huge controversy in whether or not they're related to the Huns of European records. I've heard convincing arguments on both sides, but I'm currently inclined to the theory that it was the same kernel of people with the same identity who simply changed a large part of their membership as they migrated across the steppes. Kind of like how a minority of Americans are of English ancestry, but all Americans carry a culture and identity that comes out of England. For the sake of this alternate history, let's say the Chinese and European Huns are the same. If you disagree with this, you can simply ignore the Chinese and Indian parts of this alternate history. The first records we get from the Huns comes from the Chinese, around 200 BC. China at this time was just conquered by the Emperor Cixi Huangdi, but his dynasty was short-lived, letting the country collapse into civil war. When the Han dynasty, basically the dynasty that created modern China's identity, finally pulled itself out of this strife, the Xiongnu barbarians were already raiding into the empire. United by their mighty leader, Modu Chanyu, the Xiongnu launched crippling raids on the northern boundary of the empire. The Chinese officials were degraded to marrying their princesses to the Xiongnu and paying tribute, both very humiliating to the Chinese. This created the reaction from the Chinese officials in which they prepared a great war with the Xiongnu. There were a few side effects of this. China didn't have good rideable horses the same way the Xiongnu did. This was greatly distressing because it gave the nomads much greater mobility, so they could ride circles around the Chinese infantry armies. This resulted in the Chinese searching west into Central Asia to A. find another nomadic people they could ally against the Xiongnu with, and B. a source of horses to use against the Xiongnu. China is a naturally insular civilization. A culture who thought they were the only civilization in existence until 125 BC saw little reason to expand beyond China. Chinese flings with imperialism tend to be brief and stop at a certain line in Central Asia, around 300 or so miles west of the current Chinese border. Without the massive impetus from the outside barbarian invasion, China would have seen no reason to push west. It would have taken longer to discover the outside world. Instead, Indian merchants would have probably discovered the southern coast of China 100 or so years later. The strains of empire on a naturally isolationist society and the forced interaction with other cultures resulted in a massive traditional Confucian backlash around the birth of Christ. The Confucians believed that the empire was worthless and that China could only become better by returning to traditional ways. This resulted in a massive civil war, which deeply hurt China and the loss of the empire. The civil war was created by a vicious family surrounding the emperor, hurting the nation for the family's gain. This resulted in the introduction of eunuchs and bureaucrats in the Chinese government, because they could be trusted over family. In this timeline, this never occurs, and China never develops its advanced bureaucracy. This bureaucracy is one of the dominant pillars of Chinese civilization, and has always existed, guiding China in a different, possibly better, but definitely more conservative route than most civilizations. This would never have happened in this timeline. Also, fun side note, no Great Wall of China in this timeline. The Great Wall was built against the Xiongnu by Cixi Huangdi. It looked nothing like the stereotypical image of the Great Wall we think of, which was built between the 14th and 16th centuries AD, but was instead packed dirt. Building a wall thousands of miles long is kind of ambitious, and so without the precedent, the later editions would never have been built either. As the Xiongnu tried to conquer Central Asia, they fought and defeated a people named the Kushans. Without their couches, the Kushans migrated south into Afghanistan and later India, carving out an empire in both nations. The impression I get is that they conquered a lot of land, assimilated into the native population, and very little effect on history. However, I have no idea what the actual historical ramifications would be. Frankly, this part of Indian history is so poorly recorded, I would be shocked if anyone had any idea what the historical ramifications would be, and I would immediately consider them a BS artist if they claimed to. But for any of my Indian fans who aren't BS artists, I'd be happy to hear your ideas about this in the comments. In the 5th century, India faced invasions from the north by a group of people called the Hunna. They were likely a motley crew of peoples, with some Hephthalites and some Huns. They helped collapse the Gupta Empire and create the Indian Dark Ages. This would likely still happen in this timeline without the Huns. The Hephthalites, or unrelated white Huns, would have still done the invasion. Also, the Gupta Empire was just begging for foreign conquest. It was the height of Indian civilization and culture probably ever, but wasn't really an empire, instead a group of kings paying token tribute to the central emperor in Pataliputra. The Guptas were only able to exist in an era without outside invasions or pressures. The second the Guptas came under a foreign threat, they collapsed in on themselves like a deck of cards. Some other tribe would probably have poured out of the hills of Afghanistan, as has happened countless times. The Indian Dark Ages would still happen, with the local Rajas being militarily unable to defeat the nomadic tribes, just like our timeline and has been shown endlessly in Indian history. Now let's move west, towards Europe. In our timeline, the Huns appeared halfway through the 4th century in what is now the southern Ukraine-Russia area. The Europe they saw back then was very different from the Europe we see now. The Roman Empire, although in decline, was still the dominant power across most of the continent. What most people don't know is that the Germans were a much larger group. The Germans sprawled deep into Ukraine, Romania, Poland, and Byelorussia. The Slavs were still off the board in northern Russia and the Baltics. The Huns immediately disturbed this dichotomy. They defeated the peoples of Ukraine and Romania, the Goths, thus driving them to the Roman Empire. This led to a nasty chain of events, ending up with the Roman field army being destroyed at Adrianople, and the Goths being bumped from area and area until they sacked Rome and conquered the better part of Spain and southern France. This happened countless times over. The Vandals, originally probably from southern Poland, were bumped west by the Huns until they hit North Africa, the Burgundians from northern Poland until they hit Burgundy, etc. This greatly accelerated the fall of the Roman Empire. Rome was hanging on decently. It was weak and declining but surviving. And then it had to deal with massive invasions from the north, which it simply couldn't handle, and then it had to deal with the Hunnish invasion itself. The Roman Empire then collapsed in on itself. This doesn't happen in our timeline. The Germanic tribes take much longer to conquer the Roman Empire, maybe around 100 years, and it falls very differently, with different Germanic tribes and patterns. For example, many of the tribes that tore down the Roman Empire were from the eastern part of the German region. These were tribes like the Visigoths, Lombards, Ostrogoths, and Vandals. In this part of the German lands, agriculture was scant and herding was much more important. The tendrils of civilization were much weaker. None of these states survived in the long run. The other kinds of Germanic barbarians were the western ones, like the Franks and Saxons. These people were in contact with the empire for hundreds of years, and were more developed, populous, and advanced. They tended to move more people into their conquests. Look at how England and the Rhinelands have been thoroughly Germanicized. Also, their regimes were much more stable, with England and France under still basically the same regimes as those created by the Saxons and Franks. These people, being closer to the frontier, and not being driven forward by the Huns, are the ones that conquer the Roman Empire in this timeline. This means that barbarian control would be stronger in the parts of the empire they would conquer. However, to truly understand the situation at the fall of Rome, one has to look away to the Balkans. The Balkans were originally heavily populated by Romans, with dozens of cities dotting the land with Illyrians. Then Attila and his buddies ravaged the land, enslaving and killing almost the entire native population. This left the land denuded of population. In the short run, the Eastern Romans were able to hold on to the land, but it came to be filled and colonized with Bulgars and Slavs. The Huns, driving the Germans west and killing the Illyrians, opened up all of Eastern Europe for Slavic expansion, creating nations like Serbia, Croatia, Poland, or Czechia. This would have never happened in this timeline, with the Germans sprawling deep into Eastern Europe, and the Illyrians and the Balkans on the south side of the Danube River. The Germans likely wouldn't be able to hold on to all this territory. The Germans were able to settle in the grasslands of southern Ukraine, Wallachia, and maybe Hungary because the nomadic tribes happened to be especially weak at that time. You see, the nomadic tribes would normally kill any farmers who settled on the grassland because of their better mobility. This would mean the Turks, Hungarians, and Avars would likely take these regions from the Germans. The Germans who would likely survive in Romania and maybe Hungary would probably make a pretty advanced kingdom from the hundreds of years of contact with the Roman Empire that would give them a leg up. A huge number of the troops for the empire were pulled from the Balkans, meaning that its loss really hurt the empire. The Eastern Empire, which survived, would be much more powerful with this addition. With the Roman Empire surviving later and with the Byzantine expansionism of the 6th century, the eastern half of the empire would likely be able to save much of the Western Empire, namely Italy and North Africa. Spain and maybe northern Italy would still be conquered by barbarians simply due to the distance and the greater stability of the barbarian monarchies. A more powerful Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire would have had one massive effect on history, mainly that Islam would have never gone west. Islam was so successful at conquering a huge area because the Byzantines had been bled dry by years of war, but with Illyria this would not be the case. The Byzantines would be able to contain the Arab invasions with army after army. The Muslims would still conquer Persia though, and thus move into India and Central Asia though. In this timeline, Byzantium would be a massive world power, like China of our world, dominating the world scene with both its military and culture. Whatifalthist, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, you might enjoy these two. One in which the Mongols conquer Europe, and the other in which ancient Greek mythology replaces Christianity as the dominant European religion. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, or support me on Patreon, and stay tuned for future videos. Thank you for watching.